I'm happy to welcome, especially today, Rui Thyssen, who is from Sweden, and he is a senior lecturer at Stockholm University as well, which is, I think, his main profession. A senior lecturer also at the Waldorfhochskolan in Stockholm, where is a wonderful teacher training center situated, and he speaks today about holistic how holistic is Waldorf. And in his career and his personality, people who have been long with us at the International Campus Waldorf, they know already he's a holistic person in itself because we have of in in Waldorf concepts, we have, so to speak, this about dualism. Steiner speaks so oft about mental images and will sphere, head sphere, and limb sphere, and so he speaks about those two systems. One is more in the thinking and rational realm, and then we have the limb sphere. It's in the will realm, and he combines in his biography craft and science, and this is you. I would think you do not find people like him very often who connects in his own biography these two parts. So he is a craft teacher and he has a total devotion. I think we will hear about it to bookbinding. So this is his passion till nowadays. He has been a bookbinding teacher at Stockholm Waldorf School, and he did a dissertation about the German concept Bildung, which he still uses as in the German phrase Bildung. And it's about vocational Bildung. He wrote his dissertation about, and so this gives him a place at the Stockholm University. And yes, I'm very much happy to welcome here, and I give you the word, Rui.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Jost. I have to admit that there won't be much bookbinding in this lecture. Yeah, you'll have to go back to the lecture from last year when I was talking more specifically about crafts
Yeah,
and
they are still available in the internet.
yeah, yeah. So if you feel that there's a lack of that here, that's also because I thought I've already spoken a bit about it, and I think my approach to this question will kind of bear this out too. So I'm going to start with sharing the PowerPoint. And since this is a topic I haven't really spoken of in a focused form, I'm curious to see where this will take us and how far I'll get through my preparations and so on. Hopefully, I've thought it through well enough that I won't have to rush anything. And I was and now understand better why I was assigned this question. I was thinking, why does Joss actually think that this is a good idea for me to speak about? But it became quite clear to me, and I think it's also where I kind of departed in the sense that I think when we talk about holistic in a Waldorf educational context, I think everyone immediately feels at home with a phrase such as educating the whole human being and talking about the human being as someone who not only thinks but also feels and has will or has body, soul, and spirit, or even a duality of cognition and sensing, which I think is quite important or foundational to Waldorf education as kind of the epistemology from the philosophy of freedom. And I think it could be a good idea to consider what the relation is to what is otherwise called holistic education. Today, there's lots of different books about holistic education, left and right. And one of them that's quite new um, is a book or a handbook of holistic education from 2019. And I thought we'd just take a look at the table of contents. A table of contents can tell you a lot about what something is about from the point of view of the people who have been responsible for writing about it. And so, of course, they have a brief history, but then for even the second chapter, experiencing nets of holism through the threshold body. I have no idea what the threshold body is. I honestly haven't read the second chapter yet, but it sounds interesting. And then you have the a lot of content regarding indigenous worlding, for instance, or indigenous education. You have this chapter 5 on Eastern philosophy and holistic education. There's a whole issue of care of the soul in education that I find really interesting as well. Some of you might have read this book. I'm not going to go through all these chapters because there's about 40 or so. Um, so just cast a brief look at it. Integrated curriculum for the 21st century. Holistic assessment has its own chapter. Transformation through art and vision, perhaps not so surprising, has a chapter, but that was also an indigenous perspective. Here are the chapters about practice. So this is the first chapter about Waldorf education, where it figures, written by Warren Lee Cohen and Brian Daniel Bresnahan. And then there's one on Montessori. Those are the two educational traditions that I'm familiar with. I do not know what Lohman education is. I don't know what the school forest movement in South Korea is, or the Madras schools in East Africa, or the traditional Chinese spiritual practice for personal cultivation, etc. Uh, and There are even more interesting things about narrative inquiry and sound escapes. And there's one more chapter here, Research in, on, and with Waldorf Education in the Netherlands by Aziza Mayo. And then Holistic Education in Thai Buddhist Schools next to it. And finally, there are some chapters that round out the collection here about pedagogical mediation and African indigenous education in Kenyan universities. And what I want to say with this to begin with is I think it's important to be cognizant of how is this term or point of view used also outside of our Waldorf educational context. It's easy to think that when we speak of the whole human being, this is what holistic education is. And to some degree, it definitely is. I think I I will go back. Oh, there we are. There's a summary of a characterization of holistic education from this book, which reads that it focuses on the whole child. It structures educational experience for the whole, from whole to part, fostering a view that the universe is harmonious and interconnected. There's an emphasis on inclusion. There's a responsiveness to the cultural context of students and perspectives of universality or the universal potential of the child. Interestingly, this is a characterization of Montessori education. Uh, and I think to really get some of the distinctions here, uh, I would help myself by using Owen Barfield's concept of participation. And I think when Owen Barfield writes about participation, he writes about it in the sense that historically, going far back in time, the capacity for participation in nature and in interhuman processes and so on increases the further back we go. And it's a characteristic of our time that our consciousness is largely non-participatory, that is distanced in a sense. And I think uh, holistic education is part of a wider social movement, really, uh, that desires an not maybe a return, but a renewal of participation. And I think that also means that there are at least two conceptual contexts where I think the wider discourse on holistic education and the discourse of Waldorf education perhaps need a bit more of a nuanced comparison or consideration. And I think that's has to do with views of the self and also views on the relationship between the human being and the world. Because I think sometimes it's not entirely clear when the different educational thinkers talk about these things if we actually use the same words. I'll come back to that in a second. But I would also like to say a couple of words just initially about this from a sociological point of view. There was a book published, now it's a quarter century ago, so it's actually a kind of old study. But as far as I know, it hasn't lost any of its actuality. It was, I think, widely written about in Waldorf educational circles at the time, called The Cultural Creatives by Paul Ray and what was her name? Shirley Anderson? I'm not entirely sure. In any case, they did extensive research on values in society and could distinguish three pretty distinct groups here, what they called modernists and what they called traditionalists, and then what they named the cultural creatives, or I would suggest in this context to just say holistics. And what they meant by this is that, uh, to put it briefly, up until about the late 50s, early 60s, you could really only distinguish two major groups in at least in American society, people with a modernist outlook and people with a traditionalist outlook. And what we're accustomed to in Waldorf educational contexts, which is a kind of a forerunner in many ways, uh, is a set of values that only emerged during the 60s, really. Uh, and I'm not going to talk a lot or go into what characterizes modernists and traditionalists because that'll take unnecessary time from what I want to get at. But they also distinguish between green cultural creatives, which share pretty much general values, except that they're much more concerned with the environment and uh, issues of that nature. And then core cultural creatives that also have a much wider set of beliefs regarding spirituality, for instance, and who are strong drivers of a lot of cultural development today. And I think it's worth noting too that for the most part, Ray and Anderson uh, paint a very nice and positive picture of cultural creatives. I think you could also think of shadow elements there where you have the kind of hyper individualistic focus on personal well-being that we see around us that is part of this value complex or a focus on something holistic, but mainly for personal growth. And so I think, as I wrote in the final point, this is, I'm sorry for the PowerPoint. It's kind of my personal notes so that I know what I'm going to talk about. But I think this expansion of Waldorf education from the 60s onwards can be interpreted as a reflection of the emergence of these values across society. Um, and I think why I brought this into to this lecture is because I think it's important to consider that Waldorf education arose in a social context where these values were only articulated, at least in Europe, by a very small avant-garde. So I think it it means that the concepts that we use or the language that we're accustomed to is unavoidably at least somewhat entangled in the largely non-holistic discourses of the early 20th century, where words like authority, or as I was saying before, self or I or individuality, had a somewhat different meaning than they do today. And of course, I chose those examples because I think almost everyone here that is listening is going to be familiar with the issue of trying to translate what Steiner meant when he said that a teacher is a person who is given authority by the children. Uh, in such a way that it's not misinterpreted to mean that the teacher is simply someone who directs everyone everywhere. Uh, so this says something about the difficulty with the language, how would you say, we grow up with in Waldorf contexts, and how to kind of get it to relate to the ways people speak outside of it that are also interested in this holistic aspect of education. Um, and having said that, I think we're on our way to getting to the interesting bits. So, if we want to ask how holistic is Waldorf education really, I think it's easy to simply conclude that explicitly speaking, or overtly, Waldorf education is holistic or desires to be. We speak of it in that sense. And it's also clear, even from a brief look in the handbook, for instance, or in other publications regarding holistic education more generally, that there are many of the same conceptualizations and so on that are shared. And I think there's also a strong sign of this holistic potential in Waldorf education that there are several recent doctoral dissertations that discuss the integration of Waldorf education with, as I wrote here, for instance, indigenous pedagogies or feminist holistic pedagogy. Uh, but of course, we can talk about this or consider this apart from the explicit. And now I'll get back to our good friend Owen Barfield. For those of you who are not familiar with him, Barfield was a prominent British anthroposophist and a friend of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and wrote some really, really interesting uh, books over his very long life. I think he was 95 or so when he passed in 1990 somewhere. And in a series of lectures that he held in somewhere in 1970 or so, that were published in 2012, uh, he introduces what I find to be an incredibly useful cognitive instrument because he distinguishes there between what he calls overt positivism, that is, uh, a positivistic or reductionistic outlook philosophically that very few actually would say that they adhere to. And you could extend this to cover anything, things like exclusion or hierarchically organized societies or patriarchy or racism. Almost no one is going to say that they're actively interested in being a racist. So it's easy to kind of discard that. And it's also easy to say, well, I want to be a holistic person and I want there to be, generally speaking, peace in the world and so on. Uh, but saying it doesn't mean that this happens. And this is where I think Barfield gets at something really interesting because he says there's also an unresolved positivism that lingers on in the imagination after it has been rejected by the intellect. And so we can say, and then he goes on to say there's even a residue of unresolved positivism, a RUP, he calls it, that remains in one's subconscious, even though it has been largely removed from one's imagination. You can get, I think, sometimes at this uh, residue of unresolved something, and where this lurks inside of us by examining things that make us unreasonably angry or fearful or are unwilling to consider even other perspectives. As soon as we react strongly on an emotional or affective level, there's not unusually uh, a, an indication that this is where we have something unresolved. Uh, and I think in relation to holistic issues, we could call the lack of holism something like fragmentation or reductionism. These are words that are often used to contrast holistic perspectives with other ones. Or I would suggest abstractness or dichotomizing as well. And Waldorf education clearly is not arguing for any of these. But I think it's interesting now to explore a little bit what could it be when we talk about unresolved dichotomizing or even a residue of unresolved dichotomizing. And can we do that? And I'll give you a couple of examples where I think this turns up. The first one is from the handbook. So I think it's a particularly good example. Uh, and it's from the introduction. Uh, and it reads that Jack Miller's opening essay, Holistic Education, A Brief History, shows how the intuitions that he and Ron Miller had in the 1980s in founding the holistic education movement, I call them the two bright angelic Millers, that life somehow conjured up to confront the Blakean dark satanic mills of modern industrial schools. So what I mean with this is already a statement that has dichotomized holistic education against modern industrial schools that are likened to William Blake's dark satanic mills. It's a strong image, but it's also a strong generalization of what other schools are that don't explicitly say that they focus on holistic education. And by doing this, I would say it's a way of speaking about something that is not really holistic in the sense that holistic education or holistic philosophy aims to be, but it's a kind of slipping back into the habits of imagining things in polarities. Um, I hope you understand what I mean by this. I'll give you another example from Gidley's book on post-formal education, which uses Waldorf education repeatedly as a really good example of how this could look. And there's a whole list in that book that positions post-formal or holistic education against industrial or formal education, that positions atomistic and reductionistic education versus holism, and mechanical versus organic, and instrumentality versus reflection, and binary distance logic versus dialectical paradoxical logic, and knowledge as static versus knowledge as process, or information versus wisdom. And I'm not on principle opposed to working with contrasting pairs of concepts. But when the contrast is created or constructed in such a way that one half of it is clearly the one that is intended to be positive, and the other half is clearly the one that we're intended to react negatively to and feel that this is something comparatively bad in relation to the other, then I think we are reenacting the exact same kind of thinking or imagination that got us into a situation where we felt that we needed a holistic approach. Uh, and that is, that created the issues to begin with. And so, to say a little bit more about dichotomies here, I think, uh, and this has been, or this draws a lot on what Barfield has written in other contexts also about poetry and metaphors. uh, because I think dichotomies tend to really shape our imagination. That is what we think about the world. Consider just the dichotomy of male and female that we've inherited for literally thousands of years. It's such a strong pair that it's difficult for many of us to even consider things that in a way that just doesn't even think about male and female as a relational pair. That is, it just disregards it as a polarity that's of very little or no interest. And so we bring very much of how we structure our societies into these polarities. Um, and because there's little work done on a more explicit level of trying to raise this to an awareness and imagination. And I'm not saying that there's no work done. There's a lot of philosophizing for sure, but I would say this is a strongly educational issue. And I'll give you a couple of examples later of where I think that Waldorf education really does this kind of work, but doesn't call it this kind of work, is perhaps what I tried to say here, in the sense that if you don't see that this is what you're doing, it's much more difficult to know that what you do, to aim at doing this and not to lose track of it, because you can also think that you're doing a lot of other things at the same time. Uh, and I would say, as I write here, I think from a more traditional anthroposophical perspective, I would call this habit of creating polarities or abstracting from things an expression of the life of the intellectual and mind or feeling soul. So this is kind of the way uh, a certain soul habit of the human being tends to work. And I think it's a beautiful expression of this is the dictum by this famous, by the one of the famous Greek philosophers, Heraclitus. I'm not entirely sure if I'm pronouncing that well in English, that war is the father of all and the king of all. And I think that really expresses this soul quality of we're only able to conceive of something when we place it in conflict with something else. So, in order to know ourselves as who we are, in order to know what we are as holistic educators, we construct this negative counter image that is in conflict with us, because that's how we feel our own identity. And so that's what I mean with remaining in a kind of way of imagining things that is still caught in this uh, habit that gave rise to the need of holistic education to begin with. And I assume tacitly, or now I'm saying it, that we don't really need to follow Heraclitus' dictum for all time and eternity. That is, I assume that there are also ways of giving birth to things that is not through conflict or war or that kind of contrasting. And that's why I feel that this is a pedagogical problem. It's a political problem when people are explicitly racists. And it can solve, and that problem can, at least to some degree, be solved by political action. But as soon as these things are mostly something that are part of our ways of imagining things, the metaphors we use, the habits we have, it's very difficult to make this a political question. It's much more an issue of what kind of educational measures can we find to assist us in becoming aware of our mental habits. And as I write here, I think one of those is really working with metaphors and analogies and polarities of considering other ways of thinking about things. I think when I was this spring, when I spoke to a lot of people in the folk high school movement in Sweden, uh, I was I asked them to consider if there are new polarities that we can create that aren't caught in this habit of thinking about one of them as positive and one of them as negative. And this is something, I'm saying this because it's something you can also do immediately in a school environment. You can do this with a group of sixth graders. You can ask them every morning for 5 minutes to think about polarities that have never been invented before. What about the polarity I would suggest between a garden and a starry sky? What does that tell us? There's no immediate relationship between gardens and the night sky. So it's difficult for us to imagine it as even being a polarity. So it requires a much more intense imagination to think about what does this polarity actually have to say. It might not have anything to say, it might be a bad polarity that I invented, but that's where I'm getting at this issue of working poetically, that you can practice uh, becoming used to uh, inventing new images and language, and thereby also becoming much more aware of the images that we habitually use without considering what they actually imply. So, for instance, Barfield is repeatedly concerned, as was Steiner, with our habit of using mechanical or machine metaphors in order to understand the human being. So we say that the heart is a pump, perhaps, or that the brain is like a computer. And the problem with this is that we tend to forget that these are just images of something and not to be taken literally. And so suddenly the brain is literally for us a computer, and the heart is literally for us a pump. And then we get really angry when someone suggests that the heart isn't a pump, and we can hardly understand what that person even means by saying that it isn't. And that kind of forgetfulness is what I'm trying to get at here. Of course, the heart is not a pump. A pump is a pump, and a heart is something else. And a pump is something that we have constructed by looking at how things have worked in nature. So it makes no sense at all to say that the human body is in any way like a machine in a literal sense. But of course, it makes 100% sense to say what happens if we look upon the heart as a pump. And we can do lots of interesting surgery by taking that metaphor and applying it in medicine. Uh, but it's still a metaphor. Looking at the heart as a sun, for instance, not a sun that you have given birth to, but the sun in the sky, gives us a different metaphor for what the heart is. And the question is, does it tell us anything that enriches our experience in life? If it doesn't, of course, then it might be considered useless. But we need to work on the habit of wondering, what does this metaphor unlock in my interaction with the world and with other people? And then I think there's also huge potential in working with imagining the past. That is trying to go back into the past and understanding what it was like for people uh, 500 years ago, or 50 years ago, or um, 2000 years ago, because we tend there to have one of some of the strongest habits of literalness in ourselves. So it's difficult for us to even imagine really concretely what it must have been like when we didn't have certain words. So, for instance, I just came across that the other week. The word nostalgia was coined by a doctor in, I think, the late 16th or early 17th century to describe the feeling of homesickness that soldiers had. And so clearly he had a need to describe something that had emerged at that time. And one question is, what did people feel in this realm before this word was coined at all? And how has it changed to become what we think about as being nostalgic today, which is clearly not being a homesick soldier, but something much, much wider and, in a sense, richer. And Barfield has a really interesting way of expressing this or exemplifying it when he writes that in regards to symbolism, that the essence of symbolism is not that words or names uh, mean something, but that the things or events themselves are apprehended as a representation of something, that is, a sign of something else. And the thing is, as he writes, this is the normal way of apprehension for a participating consciousness, that is, a consciousness as people had it before, fairly late in history. So when we speak about symbolical, uh, this is actually something very close to what people previously would call literal. So even when they tried to say that this is literally what we mean, uh, what a rock is literally just a rock, they experience the rock also as a representation of the divine, for instance, or of something else. And so the famous mm, um, medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, in writing about how language was used in the Bible, divides that meaning into the literal and the spiritual meaning. And then he says that the allegorical interpretation that Barfield writes about earlier in the book as being something that we tend to feel is kind of flat, because we don't normally today enjoy reading poetry about how the muses are allegories for music and poetry and history and so. But he puts those allegories as part of the spiritual meaning of the scripture. And he says that what he calls the sensus parabolicus, that is our symbolical, he includes that in what he calls the literal. And what Barfield is getting at here is we have to be so aware when we read what these people wrote 500 or 1,000 years ago, in order to see that what they're saying is so different from how we normally just experience the world. And of course, in this sense, it's something that probably has no room in a school context, because it's a something that is more on the level of post-secondary education. But there's still elements of it that you can bring into to teaching also in primary and secondary education. And thirdly, uh, what Barfield is talking about, and what I also really want to underscore, is that in order to consider this issue of holistic education, I think it's almost impossible to avoid thinking about what it means to work with our imagination more generally. Barfield formulates this in this way, that he writes that participation as a real experience is only to be won for our islanded consciousness of today by special exertion. It's a matter not of theorizing. Theorizing is the gesture of the intellectual soul, to think about things. but rather of imagination in the creative sense of the world, and therefore our first glimpse of it is commonly an aesthetic experience of some sort derived from poetry or painting. So it's a power within us uh, to actually reshape how we interact with the world. And that's what I mean with it's easy to say that we want to be on holistic education. And it's easy to say, yes, Waldorf education is very holistic. But the question for us could be to what degree are we simply theorizing about being holistic? And to what degree are we actually engaging in e- creating actual experiences of participation, that is, of holistic beingness in the world? And this is where I'll get to some, or at least one example from Steiner's didactics, because I think it's important also to see that this isn't only an abstract reflection that I'm trying to make here, but that this can actually be brought thoroughly into not just what we could do, but what we were already doing. And Steiner in I can't remember what Allgemeine Menschenkunde is in English. His foundational lectures on pedagogy uh, talks fairly extensively about the need to cultivate what he calls living thinking. And what he means by this, there's a wonderful article by Steines from 2019 about this. There's also a really fun chapter in Richard Sennett's book, The Craftsman, that has nothing to do with living thinking, but where he talks about different ways of writing recipes for how to make a stuffed chicken. Maybe I'll get back to that if I have time. But what Steiner tries to get at is that when we provide children with definitions of things, the definition of a bird, for instance, or whatever the case may be, those definitions have a tendency to be the final say in the sense that they don't have any life left in them. They can't change. The whole point with a definition is to lock something in place so that we're all in agreement of this is exactly what we mean when we say this. It's excellent as a tool sometimes to define things. So I don't think the point here is that definitions are always something to be avoided. But what Steiner wants to get at with saying that we need to characterize things, especially for young children, is that those characterizations are living. They can be continuously enriched and expand together with the child as the child grows. And Steiner has this example from, I think it's fourth grade, where one of the main lesson periods is about animals. And the example is how to characterize what a bird is. How do we do this then in reality? How do we get to not defining a bird for the kids, but actually characterizing it? And she learned from an older class teacher that one way of doing this is by taking the four elements as a point of departure, as kind of a didactical instrument to think about it, to support our pedagogical imagination, and to think, okay, so for the element of fire, we can talk about a hummingbird, and for water, we can talk about an albatross, and for air, we can talk about a swallow. Oh, I put the wrong thing in the parenthesis there, I see. And for earth, we can talk about an ostrich. So concrete birds, but we've chosen four very different birds in order to characterize what birdness actually could be. And by doing that, we provide this, in my view at least, beautiful, very open way of exploring birdiness together with the students, and something that they can then go on filling out for the rest of their lives if they want to. Now, of course, the issue I think for me here is that this needs to kind of can also be raised to this principle level, and so that we're very aware of what we're doing here, and also so that we can sooner or later make the students aware of what they have been doing and what they need to become good at doing out of their own inner capacities. Because if we just go on characterizing things for them and with them over the course of 12 years, but never ever mention that what we're doing is characterizing because it's another way of developing our conceptualizations, then it's easy not to be quite aware of what's actually going on. And then that deprives you of the agency to do that yourself. And from a different perspective, and this is something that I've just had the absolute pleasure of participating in. The artist Shelley Sachs has worked a lot throughout her life with what she calls instruments of consciousness. And I would say she uses those instruments of consciousness in order to dislodge our literalness and to release our imagination to envision something that we're not habituated to envision. And she does that to a large degree by trying to evoke a sense of wonder in relation to things that are completely ordinary. So instead of, as the heading reads, taking a walk on in the countryside or taking a walk uh, in the city, she invites participants to take a walk on the planet. And by just considering that what we're walking on is something else than the Earth, but is actually on a planet, you are invited, I would say. Of course, it's not something that happens automatic. None of this happens by itself. But you have a stronger invitation to go out on a walk for 10 minutes or 30 minutes and see something for the first time again. It helps you in that sense to enter into your perceptions in a new way. Similarly, when she speaks about what she calls the inner atelier, it's really our interiority that is talked about, but as a physical almost space in which we can remember things and place these memories next to each other. Of course, everyone remembers things all the time, so it's not really a huge discovery in that sense, but it's a way of approaching our everyday capacities in order to unlock things in them that we normally don't pay enough attention to. And that's why I think a way of summarizing what she tries to do, and of course, here as well, it would take uh, several further lectures to go deeply into that work. But I think the aim is to allow more and more of the world to become what she called a moral force or a moral imagination force that is a source of action or holistic action rather than something that we just look at and then pass by. There's a really beautiful example of this from the realm of poetry. One of the poets that Shelley incidentally often references, Rilke. He wrote a poem in 1906, I believe it was, or 1905, called Archaic Torso Apollo. So you know what an Apollo torso is, this Greek sculpture without a head and without the arms and without the legs. So you just have this torso left of marble. And presumably Rilke stood before such an Apollo torso. I think there's some theories that it might have been one in the Louvre. And he sees this, which he writes, and I'll try to make a very uh, free translation into English. And those of you who know German can follow the original. We didn't know his unheard of head in which the eye apples ripened. However, his torso still glows like a chandelier, in which his beholding, just slightly dimmed, remains and gleams. And the bow of his breast would not be able to blind you, and the quiet turn of the loins could not be the source of laughter, uh, moving to that middle that stood for procreation. Otherwise, this stone would stand disfigured and short, below the transparent fall of the shoulders, and would not flicker like the fur of predators. And it would not break out of all its edges, out like a star, for there isn't a single spot or place that doesn't see you. You have to change your life. Du musst dein Leben ändern. I think you can interpret that as you're standing in front of something and you're gripped by, I don't know, great remorse or a strong sense that I have to change everything I'm doing in my life. But I think you can also interpret it to mean that I'm standing in front of this statue and it calls me to do something that I wouldn't have been called to do if I didn't have this perception of it. And I think this is both what Waldorf education has a great preparedness, might be the word, to do, but that we always have to return to and think about, is this actually also what we are doing or trying to achieve? Are we trying to invite our students together with us to see the world in that way? And to do that also in not because we are master poets like Rilke, but because we can do this also on a very everyday level. And so this is getting to pretty close to the end of what I was going to talk about. This is kind of the a summary almost. And what I've tried to talk about here is that we can consider contrasting that isn't dichotomizing. And I think that's an aspect of what Steiner called the consciousness souled capacity in us to contrast with other things without creating a dichotomy that is locked in the same time. And that's where I think you could actually call the consciousness soul the actual peace soul. And you could call the intellectual soul for that part the war soul if you want to. And I think this more than anything requires an intensification of our imagination. That is, that we can achieve a sustained capacity for this. Uh, I spoke with Shelley a little bit about it, I remember this weekend, because I think there are some interesting examples from the late 20th century on a collective level. I think the fall of the Berlin Wall would never have happened without an immense amount of bloodshed unless a huge collective was capable for a moment to access this kind of capacity in themselves, to imagine something that wasn't caught in those habits that we've grown up with. But it's also clear that this this activity blossomed for a brief period of time, and then we reverted back to most of our old habits of doing things, and all the old problems resurfaced. The same thing goes, and that's what I was talking to her more about when with the fall of apartheid in South Africa. It's a miracle that that didn't result in bloody civil war. But it's also clear, what, 30 years later, that the potentials that were alive at that moment in the mid 90s were quickly squandered and replaced with the same kind of things that we have been doing for such a long time. So it's really a question of how can we achieve this sustained capacity to imagine things or to be called by the world, as I was saying, and to view that the encounters that we have with other people, with other things, or rather beings, I would say, in such a way that they give rise to uh, moral imaginations in us, or a desire really to interact in a way that is holistic, would be the term I would use here in this in the context of this lecture. And as I've reminded myself to say, I think the part of this is because ideas or intuitions are often grasped by a consciousness soul capacity that is educated. This is the problem with our one of the more foundational problems with the kind of education that we often engage in. And I would say not necessarily, or I wouldn't say that this is the kind of education that people engage in outside of Waldorf schools. I would say this is the kind of education we almost always engage in, uh, because we perform with our consciousness soul the same gestures that were appropriate to an intellectual soul gesture. And then the consciousness soul becomes steeped in the imaginative habits of the intellectual or polarity soul, as I think you could also call it in this context. And the problem with that is that kills the intuitions because the intuitions can't really remain alive on that level when we start theorizing, and it reverses them into their opposite, that is, their shadow aspects. This is what has happened. It's a really enlightening study to just look at, for instance, the development of how we have thought about human rights and equality across the last 300, 400 years. in the United States, these ideas were beautifully expressed in the Declaration of Independence, for instance, and then immediately turned into their opposite in social practice. Uh, for anyone who doesn't know what I'm referring to, there was slavery, there was the subjugation of women, and so on and so forth. So they even had to debate what a slave was going to be counted as in the census in order to uh, find some kind of balance between the slave-owning states and the non-slave-owning states when it came to how many representatives each state would send to the House of Representatives, I believe it's called, right? And so it's taken American society, it took American society almost 100 years to finally relinquish slavery and a bloody civil war in order to do it, and then another 100 years before it could even come to the point of the civil rights movement. And as I think anyone can tell, that society is by far not finished with this question of what we mean when we talk about equality and then do the things we actually do. So I think this is where the issue I want to get at is that we have a tendency to grasp these intuitions and really, really debase them. And that I don't want to make it into a moral question as much as I want to make it into a question of education in the sense that we need to release the old habits that have been built up over several thousand years in order to be able to grasp those intuitions in a way that allows them to even remain alive, at least to some degree. So this is my final slide, I believe. I think this is a way of trying to question Waldorf education today and going forward that isn't just trying to decide on a scale from 1 to 100 how holistic is Waldorf education, but rather to see how are we supporting the raising into consciousness of our unresolved or our taken for granted dichotomies and old metaphors. I think we have an additional issue with this because Waldorf education is so strongly rooted in a worldview. And the whole thing with having a worldview is to some degree uh, something that belongs to the intellectual soul. And so we end up in kind of the same issues that other um, educational and political movements end up in that are strongly characterized by a worldview, namely strong elements of fragmentation. If you're not comfortable with thinking about Waldorf education in this context, you can also think about socialist political groups where you can see it over and over again. The communist parties would splinter into even smaller and smaller communist factions that were fighting between each other or infighting in order to determine who had the right point of view regarding Marx and Lenin and Stalin and so on. And so in Sweden, I don't know how many different communist parties we finally ended up having, three or four at least, over the course of a couple of decades. And I think an honest view of what happens in, or what has happened in the anthroposophical movement and in the Waldorf educational movement displays certain similarities, at least, even though, to be kind, maybe we're not going that far. So there's this is a true difficulty to get free of these conceptualizations as concepts that divide. And I think it's also really interesting to try to read or interpret what we already have as a practice, because we have 100 years of practice in Waldorf education from this kind of perspective. Because to my knowledge, at least, this practice that we've developed is rarely contextualized in this sense. So we have it and we talk about it in one way, but it's also interesting to talk about what we do in a couple of different ways in order to see what we see when we think about it like that. And then, of course, from this perspective, I assume that there are certain areas in Waldorf educational practice that can be identified that need more development or that could be richer or that could be reframed in different ways, that could be talked about differently, and thereby also understood differently. So, having said all that, and hopefully it was at least semi-intelligible, I think I'm going to draw the line, and there's a good half hour if there are any questions. I have some questions to myself about things that I felt were not perhaps very clearly expressed, but it's also a work in progress. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rui. A lot to think about, and you placed the questions just in front of you, of us. Um,
Thank you for this presentation. And it sparked some things in the heart and in the mind. And it was jam-packed with a lot, but hopefully some intelligence can help me if possible. I have a question, and I want to ask if this question or this statement makes sense, if that's how I have translated it from your presentation. Intuitions, when they do not become imaginative habits, can they become polarized?
Did you say colonized?
Polarized.
Polarized, sorry.
So I can repeat. So I wrote this, that when the intuitions, they do not become imaginative habits, are they at risk to become polarized?
Hmm. Maybe I should just initially say that I've been using the word imagination here in a couple of different ways. So I'm using it very broadly to say something about the deeper levels of how we think, so that uh, we use, or people 2000 years ago used their imagination in a way, in a sense, also to think about things. And it created certain habits of language and of expression and of actions, and habits of what was considered reasonable action and what was considered completely outrageous, for instance. And for us, these are to some degree different, but we've also inherited a large degree of that. And I would say, take for instance, uh, well, the quote from Barfield about Thomas Aquinas. I would say a lot of what Aquinas was writing about was the source of that were his intuitions. And he then gave them a clothing or a form in the language that he was able to. And the question I was trying to really get at is that we have a tendency not to make our way of imagining things conscious. So we inherit through our culture and through our parents and through our educational system ways of, or habits of imagining things that belong to a way of thinking that is not really appropriate to our current social and individual situation. And so I think, or what I've been trying to say in that sense, is that we need to raise our imaginative activities to a much more intensified consciousness or awareness, so that we learn to see them the way we learn to see our thinking, then in the very everyday sense of just thinking about what I'm thinking. So I can look at what I'm doing, but I look at what I'm doing in a much more intensified inward gesture, or whatever the a good term is. I think one of the ways this can be done is by continuously trying to rename things, to see what happens if I call it something else. That's why I think it's so fun to start renaming Steiner's soul words, and not to insist that we have to always say the consciousness soul. Steiner himself sometimes says the imaginative soul, sometimes the spiritual soul, and I would suggest the peace soul is a really adequate term for certain elements in the consciousness soul. I would say you could call it the equality soul, would be really interesting to explore as well. And so just to see what happens when I use my words to say things in a little bit of a different way, or if just to see if I'm even capable of getting free of the names. You could talk a bit here about the influence of nominalism in this context, but it's not a philosophy lecture, so I'm going to refrain from that. But yeah, sorry. I'll.
I have a question to what you. I have two questions. The first one is, it slipped my mind. What was it? Just a moment. No, I start with the second one. The first one will come back. Yeah. The second one is, I wonder, you placed a bit of a contrary to a dichotomy when you say this is an imaginative and intuitive way of thinking, and this is a polarized, what Shaza just said, the polarized way, and the one is the old one, and the other one is a new one. So, and you pointed out the trap that if we start to describe the new imaginative way of consciousness and we place it towards the old one. And this in itself is a problem, you said, if we are falling back into that dichotomy. But you yourself, by pointing out the trap, you use that, you're stepping into the trap because you said us what we shouldn't do. So my question is, isn't there a possibility as well as? So why get rid of something which is called dichotomy, which is called polarized, which is maybe called war or conflict or whatever? And just in addition to that, there is a different and another consciousness approach. Maybe this was it what you wanted to say, and I just beginning to understand it. But that would be my question. So yeah, why to avoid dichotomies? They are there, and they trigger our consciousness. Of course, we need it. It's what Steiner often calls the force of antipathy. So we bring us in a contrast to something else, and by that we get conscious of something. This is a normal educational tool, and this brings me back to my first question. Now I have it again. What we are doing, of course, this translating aspect of bringing anthroposophy and Steiner and Waldorf terms into the academic life. By doing that, we have to serve the habits of the academic life. We have to serve the academic consciousness. So there is no way around it. Imagine you enter a university or start doing a bachelor master program and you just speak out of imagination. This is what Steiner relatively freely did within anthroposophic circles when he placed his lectures. So the study of man, it's a accumulation of metaphors, accumulation of symbols of blood and nerve system and so on and so on. So he's always using those metaphors in just to give us a little hint in what is the realm he tries to touch. But of course, in order to bring it into our world and bring it into an education system, and as we try to do to give the academic world any idea of what we are talking about, we have to use their language. Our language is it too. Of course, we are not on the level of Rudolf Steiner, so to speak. So this contrast, how can we overcome it? This is my question. And maybe it's better to have this idea of as well as instead of neither this or this. There's a follow-up question.
Apologize.
Maybe Nell can say something and then you can answer to both of us.
Sure.
I got the idea, Nell. You wanted to speak to what I said.
I don't want to cut off Ruhi, but I just wanted to maybe add something in, which is while you were presenting and you referenced, Barfield and Rilke. So the realm of the artist comes. And then I was thinking as you were talking about what comes up is really play, and that play is serious in our movement. And play is where we learn different ways to understand characterization, to understand the essence of things, and also positioning. And that when we take different standpoints, it can be very playful, and it brings this levity that enables us then to see these different ways of seeing. And I work a lot with drama, and conflict is always very interesting. It's when stuff starts to happen and everybody wakes up and engages. So I would say also that it's part of the ingredients that are there, but what is the relation to it? And I'm very interested in the aridity that I feel manifests in a lot of conceptual art. It has such a deadening quality to it. And so what you, I feel, were bringing was this, you were referencing and triggering for me with thinking about the metaphysical poets in the English tradition of the 17th century who yoked unlikely images together to be provocative, to get people to think freshly about things. So I feel like it's really in your talk, and it's what we're being pulled towards in this age of AI is, what is the role of the arts? What is the role of play in our relation to so much of this?
It wasn't my intention to say that we should avoid dichotomies at all costs. That makes little sense to me. I think, as you say, they are a valuable tool to understand something. But what I think is interesting and important and to a large degree necessary is to become aware of our dichotomizing imagination. That is, we have a tendency and we have inherited a culture from the Greeks, from the Romans, from the medieval philosophy as well, or at least we have inherited a perception of that culture, even though the perception might to a large degree be simplifications, where we have a huge amount of different polarities. And those polarities tend to be taken for granted in the sense that we just use them in our language. The same way we just use the idea that the brain is a computer without reflecting on the fact that there's no way the brain could be a computer. It's just quite impossible for almost any reason you could think of. And even still, our imagination has become so literal. And with literal, I mean that we can't see something as a representation, as an image, as a metaphor or an analogy. We forget that these things, that is, we're so bad at intellectual poetry. I don't know what to call it really. We're so unaccustomed to seeing the poetic in language that the language that we use becomes, binds us in a sense to our subconscious and to fragmentization in a sense too, which is where it becomes reductionist in a way without us even noticing. And that's what I wanted to get at is, on the one hand, to become aware of the inherited dichotomies that to a large degree tend to just have very circumscribing effects in our social life. For instance, I honestly don't see why the polarity male-female has any value today, either poetically, epistemologically, or whatever you may say. It just makes no real sense anymore. And there are a lot of other ways of looking at things that are interesting to explore in relation to that, at least. Of course, I'm not saying we need to do away with it, but just to even mention that it has no epistemological value tends to still be a huge provocation, which I think is interesting in itself. And when this is a provocation, that is, when it awakens a feeling of why is this something that you need to claim, there is something interesting to explore why it's even a problem for someone or for me. The same way it's interesting to explore for me why I would even feel that someone is provocative when they say that the heart couldn't be a pump. Because of course it can't be, since it's an image of something, the pump. So that's one thing. And I think then this is where it's also interesting to just explore how can we create other dichotomies? Just create new ones. A polarity between a table and a flower. So an unusual polarity to think of. What does it tell me? Does it have any artistic, epistemological value? Does it have any other value for me? Maybe not. Maybe suddenly we come up with polarities that are really interesting because we've practiced thinking about them in a much richer way. We've practiced to think that we can create polarities. We don't just need to inherit the ones that are given to us. So that's one of the things. And I think uh, from my part, I thought, or I've experienced that the academic world has a lot to offer here, that there are habits at play in academia that are really working in this direction, although maybe less from perhaps this imaginative perspective, at least imaginative in this more narrow Steinerian way of thinking of it, and more from a critical perspective. I'm thinking, for instance, of Thomas Kuhn or Ludwig Fleck. Ludwig Fleck's the ideas about thought styles and thought collectives are immensely rich tools to use or instruments in order to become aware of this. Because it's clear that almost any thought collective has difficulty discerning its own collectiveness, its own taken for granted, without being contrasted with other thought collectives. And then, of course, this is the problem when we do this is we just contrast by attacking. So the Waldorf Educational Thought Collective, because we're clearly a collective of thinkers using the same or similar language, we usually think about other thought collectives by attacking them and saying these are a bunch of materialist fools, or if I want to put it roughly. And that is not a recipe to enter into another thought collective as if it was as true as the one I've experienced as having truth. I believe, Dick, you have raised your hand, and perhaps Jost, you would like to say something in
Yeah,
relation.
just I want to give the word to Dirk.
So, yeah, first of all, thanks. It was very inspiring to listen to you, and I agree with many topics and many ideas you came up with. I only want to add one experience out of my own teaching when it comes to polarities. I want to introduce the term gradient. I teach biology and chemistry, and I always use the term gradient because like when you have polarities, first of all, it was interesting for me to learn from Steiner. I don't know where he says this. Don't ask me for the exact citation, but he mentioned that once you only go into characterization, then it's for the thinking like becoming a jellyfish. So you need definitions like bones in our body. And so this makes it, from my point of view, very clear. You don't want the students to become jellyfish, and on the other hand, you don't want to become the students rocks or bones, only bones. So it's sort of finding a middle position. And so it's always a question of finding a balance between polarities. Same with the heart is a pump. So I always come, I have to, this is a topic of biology grade 10, heart as a pump and brain as a computer and so on. So you can come up with the question, is to what extent is the heart a pump, for example, and to what extent not? So to come into this idea of a gradient. And same with sexuality, when you have to teach in biology how sexuality came about in the development of the earth. Of course, the most time the living beings, the propagation was asexual. And so then you come to all these living creatures, living beings, that sexuality comes up but you have both sexes in one individual and so on. So it's a developing of a gradient, and then you can come to modern questions of or recent actual questions of sexuality, which are important for the students today, and so on. So just to come up with the term gradient, and this is a way to use polarities and not to avoid them. On one hand, that's what I think what Just wanted to point out. It's not a question of when you try to avoid something, you easily get into the trap that you use exactly what you try to avoid from a different point of view. They get you again. And not avoiding them, but on the other hand, I think this was an idea of Nell that to get a step beyond or a step further, so to say, with from polarities to gradients between polarities. And this example, table and flower, that would be nice. Would like to, after, if we would be in one city together, I would invite you for a beer afterwards. And then it would be great. As a biologist, I would love to discuss with you the yeah, polarity between a table and a plant. Great example. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So, other comments or questions? Just to let you know, maybe what you did, Rui, you already gave us a bit of foreview of what's coming up. So if you have a look of what's going to be happen, no, I can't share it right now. Doesn't work. So we have a lecture next week by Ida Obermann about how trauma sensitive is Waldorf education. And then we have the next lecture is by Rubina Sandhu about how imaginative is Waldorf education. And so you speak about trauma and imagination a lot. So this is might be interesting to reflect on your lecture when we go into the following lectures. So there is last remark maybe in relation to the time, or maybe we have a bit of time, Shaza.
Yes, I'll be quick. So in terms of doing something with the students or bringing this into the classroom, I'm just my mind is just kind of racing at the moment. That could we use could we begin what you have taught today or shared today by bringing the language, like changing the language in the language subject, and bringing in the metaphors, the poetry, the let's just say the expression of the children in bringing this lecture basically into the classroom through maybe poetry. What would you suggest, or anyone here, how
Sorry, you break. Oh, you're muted. I'll say one very short thing to this, so that Elizabeth, you have some time to speak as well, and that is what I mentioned before. I think the easiest and also most playful way of doing that this is to just 5 to 10 minutes every day come up with new metaphors together with the students. You can start with this, I don't know, third grade probably, and talk to them more and more as the times go, as the years pass, about this capacity we have to create these images of in language. Doesn't have to be epistemologically, was heißt, anspruchsvoll. It can be very simple ways of just trying to see that we're not prisoners of our language, but that we're creatively capable of experimenting with it all the time. What happens if we stop calling men men and women women and start calling men books and women trees? Just to see if by using different words for an established polarity, it brings out a different conception. Because when we use the words we're used to, We have a whole baggage of unconscious ideas and habits that come with the words. So it's an issue of, in this sense, and this is a very limited part of it, but I think it's also the most direct and quick way of starting to think about and work with this is to just experiment with the students. Play with language 10 minutes a day. It could be a fun thing really to do in a main lesson every day, week in and week out. Ask someone for who has the new metaphor for to do for today. And what is a metaphor in comparison to an analogy? So I think that strengthens our students' capacity to imagine a lot. And then we can expand on that and think more about it, of course. Elizabeth?
Thank you. Very briefly, I don't have a question and I have only a few half-formed thoughts, but you've sparked very many more thoughts. What I notice, what I really want to acknowledge is the absolute crucial movement towards seeing ourselves as one of many holistic movements. We might like it better, we might think it's the best, but we absolutely have to see the context that we're working in. And I miss that a lot in many circles, apart from these circles here, amongst Waldorf teachers. I actually, in my doctoral work, I kind of tried to avoid the rigidity of the language of Waldorf education. I said to myself, I wanted to avoid pushing the Waldorf wheelbarrow in front of me as I was looking into how to express the goals of Waldorf education in a non-Waldorf closed way. And I just want to really acknowledge Jost and this whole group as really looking forward and laterally to other holistic movements. So thank you for beginning to spark all those thoughts that will carry me a long time into the future. Thank you, both of you, all of you.
Thank you. Lovely to hear.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we are almost at the end of our time. That was really, really inspiring, Rui. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful talk. And needs much more time to think all the single gems, as other put it in your talk, as usual, because you have this movable mind, and we become moved by it too. That was wonderful.
Yeah. I was just thinking maybe sometimes it moves a little bit too haphazardly, but it is a really interesting field to explore. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's a bit a question. It's what you said about words and calling it other names and so on. You know, that has been in the art, of course. That has been in Dadaism or something. That has been a movement already. So just to get out of the language habits. But at the same time, you said we should value our language because there are so many words. If we don't just use them, but see what there are metaphors in there are deeper meanings in, and we just use them for informations. So being careful with words, this is I think is a teacher virtue. Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being with us, and looking forward to your lecture next week, Ida. Have a nice week and all the best to you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.